Hey, what's up everybody? It's Flux with fluxwithit.com, and today we're going to check out a module called the Writeable Quantizer. You can grab this kit off of synthcube.com, or you can get it as a PCB and panel, or you can get it as a fully complete module. What this module basically does is it's a quantizer, but it's unique in that it doesn't have any set scales already built into the module. It allows you to write your own scales into this module. And that's really cool because that means that we don't have to use traditional scales. You can do microtonal things. You can really get very experimental with how you use this module. I'm basically just going to cover some of the very fundamentals of it, and I'll let your mind kind of wander with it, and at the end I'll show just some random patches using different experiments with this thing. So here we have our front panel. On the front we have our CV input. That's where we're going to send our control voltage for pitch. That's usually going to be an unquantized voltage that we're sending into it. And then we have our trigger input. This basically tells it's kind of like a sample and hold circuit, tells it to turn on or off. Then we have our quantize input. Now what that's for is essentially we have a quantize on-off switch at the top here. And when we have that off, that will allow us to turn the quantize on and off per step, or if you send it like a gate or a square wave or whatever, it will basically turn the quantizing on or off. Then we have our CV out, which is going to handle the actual quantized or unquantized output pitch. So that basically, depending on where we have this set to, will decide whether we're shooting out quantized voltages or if we're setting out a unquantized voltage. And then of course if we shoot it a quantized input here, gate, it will turn that quantizing on and off as well. Above that we have our aux CV in. This is summed to our CV input, and we have a attenuator up here as well, so that we can decide whether or not we want a whole lot of quantized input or if we want just a little bit. Next to that we have our slew CV in. This is basically like a lag circuit, and we can use the attenuator here to set the amount, and then we can also attenuate the amount of the CV input for that as well, which is really useful because that means that we can send things like an LFO into that and have per steps just kind of slewing, and before they reach their quantized value, they kind of have this drag to them, which is really fun. Then we have the write input. The write input's really important because that's basically a gate input that's going to trigger it to copy whatever CV input signal it's getting at that moment and store it to a scale. Then we have our erase, which when we send a gate to that and it's striking the exact CV, it'll erase that step. Above that we have our up, near, and down switch. That means that we'll be quantizing to the highest note next to it, the closest note, or the note a step down. Below that we have our unipolar and our bipolar. So we have 0 to 10 volts or plus minus 5 volts. That's basically useful if you want to use an offset for sending it an LFO or something that's going to go into negative voltage ranges, or if you just want to use a sequencer that goes 0 to 10 volts. The write button allows us to manually trigger a sampling of whatever CV value we're currently sending it. And then we have our load, save, erase, and our bank switch. So when the bank switch is in the center, it disables the load, save, and erase so that we can't accidentally hit anything. If we have our bank in the up position, we can load any stored voltages that we've created a scale with, or we can save to that voltage, or save to that bank. Same with bank 2, we can save stored voltages into that bank and then recall it. So let's say you wanted to do something specific, like I want to add a C minor bank into it. You can do that and then store it there, so whenever you switch to bank 2 and turn quantize on, you'll be outputting a C minor scale out of this thing. Now let's go ahead and do a very basic patch. What I've got here is the Synthrotex Sequence 8, which is a non-quantized analog sequencer. So what we're going to do is we will send our pitch into the CV input, and I'm going to send the output is going to the E350 morphing terrarium. And currently you can hear that it's not quantized. And I can get that smooth sound out of it. Now, let's say I want to quantize, or I want to record the scale that's on here. This is not a set scale. It's not, it's not C minor, it's not any kind of particular scale. It's just an analog sequence. But let's say I like how that sequence sounds and I want to sample it. I can do that. I'm sending the clock output. I'm going to turn the hold hard on. I'm going to reset my sequence so it's on the first step, and I'm going to send my clock output to the right input of the quantizer. So now when I turn this on, the clock is going to send a pulse each time I change step, and that pulse is going to write that current CV input to the quantizer. So I'll turn to bank 1, and I'll turn hold hard off so the sequencer will start to play, and then when I get back to step 1, I'll shut it off. Now you'll see both LEDs are lit on my quantizer here. That's because it's trying to reach a set voltage, and it has reached that set voltage. So now if I go ahead and play my sequence and I turn quantize on, you'll hear it's that same sequence because that's what I'm quantized to. But let's send it now, instead of sending it the sequence 8, I'm going to send it an LFO. Okay, so now I'm sending the Writeable Quantizer, just a simple LFO from the Suit and Tie Guy Sound Labs Mankato filter. So basically it's just a sine wave going into the CV input, but because I quantized it to my sequence 8 steps, I'm getting that same sound out of it, but I'm getting different shapes out of it. So this will allow you to get really interesting musical results by playing around. Now if I turn on the slew, I can have it slew in between steps a bit. I can also turn quantize off, and you'll hear that it's just a sine wave going into it. But what gets fun about that is when I send that clock input from the sequence 8 into that sine wave, that sine wave is having the CV input, but I'm going to send the clock input to the quantized input. So now it's going to quantize whenever it gets a clock pulse. Let's turn that clock up a bit. And if I turn the slew up, you can get some really interesting note patterns out of it that way. Now I can also send things like an LFO into the auxiliary CV in for some added craziness here. And again, that auxiliary level CV input is being summed to the first CV input, so this allows us to get like interesting octave jumps and things like that. Or let's say, let's give it just that straight quantized output now, and send it that auxiliary CV in again. And if I turn that up, turn it way low so I get just a little bit. So a very useful way of using the writable quantizer would be to store voltage from a non-quantized pattern that you really like, and then trigger that pattern from other sources like LFOs, random sources, you know, all sorts of different things. And then use your pattern from your unquantized sequencer, like the sequence 8, on one melodic source while you're using your writable quantizer to, you know, control other oscillators and other sound sources, so that you're getting a similar melody that's being rearranged and played in different patterns. Alright, so in this patch, basically what I got going on is it's the exact same CV controlling both the System 1 and the Morphing Terrarium. The only difference is that the Morphing Terrarium is getting writable quantizer information. So about every third step or so, I'm slewing the CV to the quantizer, and this is allowing me to get, you know, some interesting off-stepping and changes. And I've only written about half of this scale to the quantizer. So the Morphing Terrarium is only getting a bit of the notes, whereas the System 1 is getting all of the notes. The System 1 isn't having any kind of slew, whereas the Morphing Terrarium is. Now if we want to have a lot of fun with this, I can go ahead and start sending some quantized input into it as well. Let's change the timing. And you can hear that. You hear that Morphing Terrarium here? Let's turn that down. And as I change the timing to the quantized input, it lets me get some interesting changes to the melody.